Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with works that don't work. And oh my goodness, you pegged this foot right at the start. The minute I said, oh, here's a new series called Works That Don't Work, a bunch of you just chimed in with Liszt's Dante Symphony. What can I say? You nailed it. It's funny because I just did a talk, if you're watching this series of videos, and this is not the year 3785, the Faust Symphony here with there we go, with Kirill Karabits and the Staatskapelle Weimar, which is a sequel to their previous version of the Dante Symphony, which wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. Why? Well, let's face it, the Dante Symphony isn't great. Now, I do not want to hear any of you chime in with, I love it. It's the most wonderful thing that I've ever heard. It shattered me for the first second that I encountered it. I don't care. Nobody cares whether you like it or not. This is not the subject of the video. The video is, why are there no great recordings of the Dante Symphony? And the problems can be many. I mean, it can be some sort of inherent difficulty in the music, or it could be that maybe the idiom is just, or just out of style and people don't get it, or it could be something really serious in the work itself. And here, it's inherent in the work itself. Doesn't mean there can't be beautiful performances. I have a whole stack of them, and varying degrees of success or failure. Ironically, there are two major issues, and the irony part is that the biggest issue is the part that really ought to come off really well, which is the first movement. Because as you may know, the Dante Symphony is in three fun-filled parts or sections. You have the Inferno, big loud first movement, and then you've got Purgatorio, and then Liszt gave up trying to do Paradiso, so he added the Magnificat as an ending, which is really copping out, quite frankly, however nice that ending is, and it's very pretty. And then there are two different endings you could pick. They're just optional. I mean, Liszt had no clue where he was going with this music. That's the truth. And the reason is obvious. It's because the entire work is one giant expressive decrescendo. I mean, the bad guys have all the fun, right? Inferno is big and loud and beefy and juicy and crazy and screechy, and you can do anything you damn well please. It's wonderful. And then Purgatorio? Well, what do you do musically with a Purgatorio? It's neither here nor there, is it? I mean, you're being purged. I mean, it's like, it's like taking a laxative. I mean, what's the musical equivalent of that? And so, yeah, it's like a slowish movement, and it's nice, but it's not terribly distinctive. And then you're supposed to end up with a luminous vision of divine paradise, which is musically inexpressible. I mean, let's face it. I mean, it's just a hopeless task, number one. And number two, how could you ever seek to create? I mean, what would it be? Would it be loud and triumphant? If it's quiet and ethereal, haven't you already gone to sleep after the Purgatorio? It's not a musically effective scheme, no matter how you deal with it. Even Thomas Addis, or whoever it was, who wrote that wonderful new ballet, the Dante ballet that we just talked about. I think it was Thomas Addis. I don't even remember composers' names anymore. But we talked about it recently. He had to deal with that. And he did it rather well, because minimalism, it turns out, is sort of a good technique. If you're going to do Paradiso, you can do fun things. And he did. But, he had a modern aesthetic, so he could be very eclectic in the materials he tossed in. Liszt wasn't that kind of composer. And so what was he supposed to do? Well, he did a Magnificat, which is fine, but it tells us absolutely nothing. And it's not what Dante wrote. And so there you go. But the real problem, in my view, isn't even the second half, which is admittedly going to be a failure. So, I mean, it's kind of nice because it's going to be a failure and it fails. It's the Inferno. The Inferno, which is never savage enough in most performances. I mean, you're supposed to go crazy. We have the same problem when we deal, speaking of Infernos, with Tchaikovsky's Francesca da Rimini. What could be more of a crime than a dull, flat performance of Francesca da Rimini? It's supposed to be hell, hell, hell. Well, Liszt's Inferno is all Inferno. I mean, you've got, he even tells you what the parts are. There's little notes where he writes, the clarinets and the violas represent satanic, malevolent laughter. And they go, hee. I mean, he does it quite well. He really does. There's a lot of noisy, bombastic, chromatic sludge, screeching and moaning. And then, of course, there's a tune that pops up, because in Liszt, finally, everything sort of solidifies into a diatonic. Well, I wouldn't call them tunes. As I said before, they're sort of ideas. It's bum ba da 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 dum bum bum ba ba da 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 dum bum. But, you look at the score, you've got like 2 sets of timpani and a tam-tam that's going crazy at the end. It's going, da, da, da. The cymbals make a crescendo. The tam-tam's going whack, 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 whack. You never hear it. There's no performance in which you hear the actual percussion parts correctly. And I mean, the bass drums thudding and crashing. I mean, it should be absolutely insanely overwhelming, and you should play it in the campiest possible way. I mean, there is no amount of bombast, exaggeration, or emotional excess that is sufficient for the Inferno. And they're all afraid of it. Everyone who's ever played it is afraid of it. That's absolutely true. I mean, I've never heard a performance of the Inferno that is infernal enough. And of course, they're worried. They're worried because if they really make the Inferno that interesting, then what about the rest of the symphony? Well, if that's how you feel, don't do the Dante Symphony, because you're doomed no matter what happens. And the only way that it's going to work is if you accept defeat and then just go for it. Go for the jugular. I mean, the noisier and crazier Inferno is, the more likely you are not to pass out during the Purgatorio. And the Magnificat is its own thing, because it's vocal and it has its own aesthetic sort of criteria that are a little bit different from the rest of the symphony. So you can play it very, very beautifully, and it'll come off okay. I suspect that the piece would work better than it usually does if somebody had the guts, to just do it that way, to let all hell break loose at the beginning, and then to take the rest of it as seriously as you possibly can, and play it with as much, energy and flow as you can, and how much juice you can put into it, and then we would have something to talk about, and it very well might change our view of the work. It might, against all odds. It could be that the piece comes off rather better than it usually does if the performers don't sound like they're embarrassed by it, and they're just doing it for the sake of, because they feel they ought to, or because the Inferno is so much fun, and the rest of it is just so not. So that's the deal with Liszt's Dante Symphony. Not as successful as his Faust Symphony, because the program governing the thing isn't as musical. It's not as readily susceptible to musical treatment. And that's the issue. So what can I say? We all know it. We all basically agree that it's problematic, at least on recordings. Maybe some of you have seen live ones that really worked. But then again, something working live doesn't count, frankly, because it's live. It's a whole separate thing. And when you're there, you're excited and juiced up, and everything is gorgeous when it's live. I mean, I've never been to a live concert I didn't enjoy, even when the performance was abysmal. Just horrible. And you come back with a memory of it being so lovely. If you actually heard a recording of what you enjoyed so much live, you probably would have been horrified. But anyway. The Dante Symphony is definitely one of the works that just doesn't work. And it may be that it never will. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.